Okay, we're going to move on to thrips now, another semi-common problem that you see in some crops in a greenhouse or in aquaponics. And here's a really good picture to see what thrip damage actually looks like. And there is your western flower thrip, okay? On a plant, it actually looks like a small flea. It's extremely small, narrow, and elongated. And they will jump. They jump like a flea. You'll maybe try to poke one with your finger and it will jump 4 inches away on the leaf and be moving around. Very quick and very small. But this is distinctive of thrip damage. You get the silvery leaf damage. They really like to attack light green leafed lettuces. So that's where I would see it first in my greenhouse if I'm growing a variety of types of lettuces. And if you only have a few thrips, something like this, maybe a few less marks, is still sellable. Most people wouldn't even notice it. But as those thrip populations get bigger, your entire leaf surfaces will look scarred like this, and it turns into an unsellable product. And I'm telling you, if you don't do anything about the problem, you can have population explosions with thrips. This is the problem that they had when I took over the rooftop greenhouse in the NFT portion of that facility. They had so many thrips that they had to trash every head of Bibb lettuce in the facility, and they actually lost a contract with a very large hotel that they were selling hundreds of heads of Bibb lettuce a week to because of that problem. They couldn't deliver that week. They had to shut down operation, wouldn't have Bibb for 4 more weeks, and guess what? That hotel found a new source, and that was never an option again to be able to sell to them. Big problems. Okay, so they're very common to see in dense growing environments. There's over 6,000 species. They can actually bite humans. If populations get high enough, you'll get little bites. If you've ever heard the term a no-see-um out when you're camping, well, there's a good chance that was a species of thrip that was biting you. It's not a problem in small numbers, and if you've got high turnover crops like lettuces or herbs that are constantly going in and out, a lot of times if you get a small influx, they'll get taken care of just because you're rotating crops. But they can become a problem. Leave small marks, we talked about that, on the plant from feeding from the juices. So how do we eradicate thrips? Well, my number one suggestion would be a predatory mite, okay? Thrip predatory mite. And specifically Amblysseus swirsky, okay? You want to get Swirsky mites. They will attack thrips readily and actually is a very good investment because they will completely travel that plant's surface and eradicate the population. Now, if it's out of control, like any other insect, it's a lot harder to come back from that because a lot of these mites and things only eradicate the larval and the nymphal stages. So you're going to have them killing the babies, but the adults are going to have to live out their life cycle until they just die. All right, and that can take a little while. So we want to limit the adults, limit the populations before we actually start applying our fix to the situation. You can also use Neoselius cucumaris, but I would not recommend that in a hot, humid environment because I just haven't seen the results with that. I've read a lot of papers that they do a lot of good things, and again, a lot of this can come down to environment, but I would say Amblysseus swirsky is where I would first point you to. This is applied as a topical in a shaker, applied to all older infected plants and to all younger unaffected plants within proximity in case they try to spread, okay? So if they're getting eradicated, they're gonna mushroom out, spread out, try to further out and get away from that problem. So we want to already have a fix in place out there. So don't just treat the plants that are affected, treat the plants around those as well as a precautionary measure. And continue the treatment until the problem is resolved. Not until it's almost resolved, until it's resolved and you don't see anything for 2 weeks. Then you can cut it back. And again, if you saw it happen once, it's probably going to come back sometime in your future. So get on a regimen, a precautionary regimen of just maybe applying these once a month and keep stretching it out until you actually finally see thrips again, and then make that your mark and say, okay, once we get this taken care of, we got to make sure, you know, every 4 weeks or every 6 weeks we reapply these so that we don't have any populations come in and reestablish in our growing area. All right, and this is an awesome picture of Amblysseus swersky. And check out this thrip here, okay? This is like Conan the Barbarian coming in, lifting this guy up, and he's just gonna bite him right in the side and suck the juices out of him. I mean, horrible creature if we were ever at this microscopic size. You wouldn't want to run into this guy. And he'll walk around, grab that guy, lift him up, suck the juices out of him, throw him to the side, move on to the next. And they do their job, okay? They'll also reproduce, and that will continue these life stages and the population control of the thrips. Okay, this is the leaf miner, all right? And this is actually a leaf miner fly. There's several species out there like anything else, but this is a common species of leaf miner that we can see attacking field crops and greenhouse crops. And this is what they do. So they're going to fly up to that leaf, and they're actually going to lay their egg, deposit it between the two surfaces of leaf tissue. Okay, so right in the middle of that leaf. And as the larva hatches, he starts crawling through the leaf and eating, basically looks like a maze, and eating the tissue. And you can see this is new tissue, and this is what he's gone through, and that's his path. And he kind of leaves like a trail the entire way, where he's destroying all the leaf tissue. And if you follow it, right there is the actual larva. You see, he's at the end of the trail. And you can't really spray these with pesticides because the pesticide hits the leaf and they're inside the leaf. So it doesn't affect them like it does a lot of other soft-bodied larval stages of insects. And there, you know, you can't knock them off with water. There's a lot of things you can't do because they're inside the leaf. So we have to use a beneficial bug for this that works really good. Naturally, what this does is at the end when he's done eating, he's just going to drop out of the leaf, and he develops on the ground. I think it's 30 to 40 days later, and he'll develop and emerge as a fly out, and repeat the process. One more reason why it's good to keep a clean growing environment, because let's say you had this and this larva dropped out. Well, if you're sweeping up every day or every other day and keeping the area clean, it doesn't matter if he's hatching out 40 days from now, he's gone. He's not going to do anything to you. So good reason to keep the environment clean. Leaf miners are, again, the developing larva from a leaf miner fly. We've talked about the fly inserting its eggs, and we've talked about sprays not being effective. Sorry about that. Sometimes I get a little ahead of myself. The parasitic wasps for leaf miners are going to be Diglyphus isaiah and Dognusa sibirica. And both of these actually work really great. Isaiah and sibirica. I would say when you're buying this, talk to the company that you're buying the beneficial from and see what they recommend for your specific environment, because one will work better in your environmental conditions. But these are the two responsible for controlling. And here's a picture of sibirica, okay? Sibirica, we just want to get an idea of what it looks like. And he's on this leaf looking at that leaf miner's trail, and he's hunting him down, all right? The parasitic wasps can sense where the leaf miner larvae are, and they land on that leaf. They have an innate sense to be able to tell where they are. Epcot has actually done tests where they've created mazes, and the wasps, where they put leaf miner larvae at the end, and the wasps were able to fly them with precision and ease. Extremely complicated mazes, and they flew these without a hint of not knowing where they were going, right to the end target. They knew what they were going after, okay? They had a biological sense. So once on the leaf, they will walk the path of that larva that he's used to destroy the leaf until they reach him. They parasitize or sting the larva, inserting an egg inside, which later hatches to be another parasitic wasp. So very similar to the Colmani wasp that we see parasitize aphids. This is a very similar process, but this is a specialized killer. He just hunts for leaf miner larvae, and he knows how to get them and sting them in the middle of that leaf tissue. Okay, a very specialized killer. Okay, and next we have mealybugs. All right, and you can see their distinctive small round bodies. They've got a white waxy substance coming off of them, and there's a bunch of different species, but you can see a lot of them have these celiac hairs coming from around their bodies. Look very funky, and they cluster up. You can see this one over here is kind of a larval stage, and this one doesn't have quite as much wax on it, so you see a little bit more of the orange body that's hiding underneath that coating. And I'll tell you, for 7 years, I didn't really ever have a problem with these guys, but 1 year, the first year I moved out on this property, I had a wave of them attack some tomato plants that it was my fault. I left them in too dense of an area for too long. I was out of town giving a talk. I came back. 2 weeks later, it was 2 weeks too late. And they had, basically populations had exploded and spread to 100 tomato plants. That entire year, I battled mealybugs in those tomato plants. Since then, I haven't seen one. I hope I never see them again. But it goes to show you that if you're not using pesticides, and I was actually relying on hoping a natural predator would come in and take care of them and manually just removing them from the plants, that never worked. I had them throughout the whole year, and they actually killed a couple plants that were weaker. So they can be a serious problem. I wrote them off for many years, but not always. This is what it's going to look like when their populations get really heavy, okay? You can see a lot of the little larval stages here and that white waxy substance building up. Here you can see some of it removed, and you can see where it's weakened the plant tissue. It's eaten away at this plant tissue, and that's going to rot and start to die. That's where infection sets in. So they're small, soft-bodied insects covered in a white powdery wax coating. Some species have multiple celiac hairs coming out of their sides, often form clusters, perform warm, damp conditions. So that's why I got them. I'm in Florida, it's warm. I was in a greenhouse, it was nice and humid, and these plants were really tight together. So that microenvironment became even more humid and a perfect environment for these guys to spread. They perform warm, damp conditions, and very similar to aphids, which I actually didn't mention, is they can attract ants from their honeydew excretions. So as we said, a lot of these insects are feeding off of the plants. Well, their waste product is a sugary substance, and it's called honeydew, and that's a very high sugar substance that ants like and that they will feed to their larvae, to their larval stages, and they'll actually bring their larvae in and plant them in with the aphids. They'll farm the aphids into small groups, protect them from any predators so that their young can feed off of them. It's called aphid farming, and I didn't just make that up. They actually do that. So it's kind of crazy, but since a lot of these bugs are on the underside of the leaves, if you're looking through your crop, say eggplants, and one of the tops of the leaves, instead of looking dark, lush, and green, it looks shiny, like it almost has a little bit of a waxy coating on it. It's shining and glistening. That might be honeydew dripping from a leaf above it. So a lot of times you'll see that. The honeydew comes down, you might not even know you have pests yet, and then you flip up a leaf up top and there's 100 aphids hiding under it. So it's a good thing to look out for when you're trying to identify this stuff starting out. And again, anything that looks funny, go investigate it. Don't write it off as, oh, that's just plant stuff. You need to get a visual catalog going in your head so that you can solve these things without having to run to a book or run to a video or whatever it is to solve everything. You're going to start to experience all the things that I've experienced, and instead of just writing them off, get down there, inspect it, make a mental note so that you know for the next time, so that it doesn't take you a half an hour, it takes you 5 seconds and a glance, and you know what you have to do. The big fix for a mealybug is going to be a mealybug destroyer that you can purchase. So this is, again, if you're not using pesticides. I think if you're using pesticides, you can use a soap spray, something like that, and it will suffocate it because it's a soft-bodied insect. But again, this is all pesticide free, so we go with a mealybug destroyer. And this is the mealybug destroyer here. It's actually a larva, and it can look a lot like a mealybug if you see this. But it's different because it's not just a round oval with a couple ciliate hairs. These actually come off the top of the body, and you can see they're significantly bigger than the mealybugs, okay? They're big. So this is what an adult looks like. A lot of times if these do come in naturally, people kill them because they think, oh, that's a mealybug. It's not. He's actually a good guy. And to me, size is the big thing you look out for. Look how big he is compared to these little guys. If you see him, take a picture, go research it. They're so slow, it's not like he's gonna run away from you. And give him a few seconds before you kill him because it might be a good thing for you. Okay, next is whitefly, all right? And this is pretty common depending on the crops that you're growing. And you can see this is a close-up of one of the whitefly species right on the tissue of a plant. And he's actually sucking leaf juices right out of that, out of the surface of the leaf there. That's how he's feeding, he's pulling them out. And while they don't do a ton of physical damage to plants unless they're in really, really high population numbers, these guys are bad news. Here we can see several different stages of development of whitefly larvae. And we can see the small clear larvae are the beginning stages, okay? These are the beginning stages. Then they grow up to this, then they, which is a larger, clear, opaque size. Then you start to see some black internals develop in them. That's actually the fly developing inside there. And then eventually they're going to hatch out and fly out as a white fly. So there's more than 1,550 species, a lot of different types of whitefly out there. They feed on juices from undersides of leaves, or as the picture before showed, on the surfaces. Most of the time you see these on underside of leaves though. So they are common carriers of plant diseases and responsible for quickly transferring diseases throughout a crop. And this is huge, especially in the tomato greenhouse industry or eggplants. So these whiteflies can land on one infected plant with some type of transferable disease that's incurable, and any plant that they go ahead and move to next, they're going to transfer that disease on. So there's several crops that we'll talk about a few in a few more slides, but something like eggplant, like tomato, these are known to attract whitefly. Kale. If you know that's going to happen, go ahead and bring in some measures to take care of them before they come in and build a huge population that you have to actually take care of. Okay? And again, they're probably the #1 destroyers of tomato farms and tomato crops around the world because of disease transmittance. And while you might be okay if 1 or 2 tomato plants in your whole plot get a disease that's going to kill them right away, but if that gets transferred out to 50% of your crop and you're already 5 months invested into growing this crop, that can kill your year and put you out of business. So these are definitely a bug to pay attention to, and don't underestimate the damage they can do. We like to go back to our good friend Amblysseus swirsky, the predatory mite. Well, he actually also feeds on larval stages of whitefly. So he's a very good predator to have around. He eats several different things, and that would be my #1 go-to. There's also a parasitic wasp, which is Encarsia formosa, and this is extremely effective in the greenhouse environment. And it works very similar to all of the other parasitic wasps that we've seen and talked about so far. Here we can see some of the different life stages of that parasitized wasp, the formosa. And we can see, here's a parasitized whitefly pupa, okay? Whitefly pupa, parasitized. He's black, the whole thing's black. From there, you're going to see an emergence hole right here where he crawled out. Remember the circular hole we talked about? That's pretty common with the parasitic wasps. From there, we see this wasp actually emerging in this microscopic photograph, coming right out of that hole into the environment. And then here's your adult. And again, that looks very much like a fruit fly. And that's going to fly out and start attacking other whitefly pupa. Spider mites. Okay, let's go ahead and talk about spider mites. You can see a couple spider mites here on the left, and then you can see some damage here. That looks like it's probably a strawberry leaf, but you see the webbing right here in between the junction of the leaf and the stem. That's very common, and the tiny little red specks are these red spider mites here that you see. And there are a couple crops where this is more common than others. Again, strawberries seem to love them. Some other vining crops, sometimes cucumbers, but tomatoes, they can also show up in big numbers. There's over 1,200 species. They live on the underneath sides of leaves where they live on the underneath sides of leaves where they feed on plant juices, and then as their populations grow, they start to form those webbings at the junctions. They spin protective webs which grow as the population grows, and it's very hard to get rid of without sprays when the population is strongly established. So they grow and have a quick life cycle and are able to populate an area very quickly. So you can go, from 1 week having a few spider mites to 2 weeks later having a heavy population that's doing big damage to that plant. For spider mites, the predatory mite that I would recommend is Phytosimilus persimiles. He's a very good, very targeted killer for spider mites, and it's another predatory mite. Looks similar to a spider mite actually, but feeds on spider mites. So persimiles is what you want. And again, we've got another guy here. Here's our mite. He's got the spider mite held up, and he's actually sucking the juices out of that mite and doing what we want because we bought them and put them in there. You may get some beneficial mites to show up on their own because they are in nature, but as far as I'm aware, that doesn't happen at a fast enough pace because they're not very mobile. So unless you're maybe in a field area or something with other crops where they can come in, that might happen. But other than that, these aren't going to just come into the greenhouse environment. You need to introduce them in there. So now I'm going to just go through a couple different types of vegetables and what I'm going to tell you you're probably going to see, okay? So these are what I would look out for. You may see other things, but these are the main pests that you're going to see when growing these crops, all right? So lettuces, greens, and herbs. So greens, I mean mustards, I mean collard greens, Swiss chard, kale, things like that, okay? You're going to see aphids. That's what they like. They really like leafy green items. You can see thrips. That would be secondary there. Again, light green colored lettuces, they seem to be very attracted to. They like bib lettuce a lot. Caterpillars would be third on there, which caterpillars are going to love probably every one of these crops we mentioned. And we can keep these guys out by using some screen or some exclusionary methods to keep the moths and butterflies away from the crops in the first place. And if they can't lay their eggs there, we're not going to get caterpillars. Tomatoes, whitefly is my #1 guy that I'm on the lookout for and that I want to keep away, specifically because of that disease transference. Tomatoes are a long-term crop, 3+ months before you actually start getting fruit off of them. You don't want to be 4 to 5 months invested in that and then have them die suddenly from disease that was transferred by a whitefly. Caterpillars love tomato plants. Again, we want to use exclusionary methods on them. Aphids will show up sometimes. I grow a lot of tomato plants. Aphids are never on the tomato plants unless that's the only crop I'm growing and there's some kind of nutrient deficiency problem. So I know they can get on tomato plants, but they're almost never on my tomato plants. They show up again on the target plants that we set, the sacrificial plants we set out in the greenhouse. Spider mites can definitely be a problem, especially in warm, humid areas that are densely grown, that you pack those plants in very densely. Mealybugs, like we mentioned, can be a problem, and leaf miners can also be a problem. Now, leaf miners are almost never detrimental. They may hurt a few leaves here and there, but unless it does, there's a huge population, you're not going to see them really kill your plants or affect the production. It's just unsightly to see those larvae developing in all the leaves. Cucumbers, aphids would be my #1 guy to look out for. Then caterpillars, Then we have beetles. So cucumber beetles are large, and they will eat through cucumbers and eat through cucumber plants. They'll destroy the plants. But just like caterpillars, we can keep them out with screens. Leaf miners, and then thrips. Not very common, but they're more common in the flower. So we see thrips on light green lettuces, but we also see them in flowers. All like squash blossoms, zucchini blossoms, the blossoms on the end of cucumbers, and they live in that pollen and thrive in there. So keep a lookout for that. A lot of times you'll see them actually moving around in the pollen area of the flower. For eggplants, so aphids would be my #1 thing to look out for, then spider mites, then caterpillars, then broad mites. That's another type of mite we didn't talk about a lot, but this is a mite that can highly affect crops in warm climates. And in Florida, you can almost guarantee if you're going to grow eggplants, if you're going to grow peppers or capsicums, then you're going to have broad mites. So treat before they become a problem and get out of control and really distort your plants and harm your production. Leaf miners, mealybugs are also down there on the bottom of the list. Peppers or capsicums, we've got broad mites. I'd say #1, that they're microscopic, so you have to really do your work to identify them, but they're going to show up in a warm climate on peppers. A lot of people attribute so many problems to their plants to being nutritional problems. Many times they're microscopic mites that they don't see. They don't know they're even there, and they will highly distort and retard pepper plants. So we've also got aphids, we've got caterpillars, we've got leaf miners, mealybugs. You could also throw grasshoppers on here, that kind of thing. Leaf-footed bugs, they can also show up. So a little bit continued here. Caterpillars, weevils, shield bugs, beetles, grasshoppers, and other large predatory insects can be controlled by using exclusionary methods such as greenhouse film, screening, row covers, a lot of different options out there, whether you're indoors or you're outdoors, and to keep them out of the greenhouse or the growing area. Beneficial for many of these in nature are birds, but we don't want those in our greenhouse or in our growing area because we don't want bird poop on our produce. So there are beneficials out there still for these larger insects, but they're not beneficials we're going to employ in our growing environment. And because of that, we want to use screens to exclude these things from the environment. We can increase populations of some of these greenhouse beneficials by up to 10 times by supplemental feeding. So we actually feed them because, as I mentioned, these bad bugs populations are going to dwindle as the good bug populations go on the rise. Well, if we can continue feeding them an alternate food source, that will keep them around in high populations, and any little hotspots that pop up will immediately get eradicated. You can buy pre-made food and mix with honey or sugar to make a paste. You mix this thick and distribute it on seed stakes or other appropriate distribution methods, little plates, bowls, etc., around your greenhouse. Specifically, when dealing with parasitic wasps or ladybugs, when you trim the foliage that is infested with aphids, okay, so when you have leaves that are heavily infested, lower on the plant, older leaves, ready to come off, but they do have parasitic wasps actively attacking the aphid population, and you probably see a lot of unhatched mummy wasps sitting there attached to the leaf surface. Go ahead and place these leaves in a black garbage bag with the top left slightly open. As that bag heats up, most of the beneficials will fly out. They'll escape because of the temperature rise. They want to go back to a more moderate temperatured environment. So they'll fly out. They'll go throughout the greenhouse to new targets, while the aphids are less mobile and stay in that bag to die. Now, also because you're heating up the bag, sometimes that will speed up the hatching of those mummy wasps so that you actually get a large population of wasps that will just fly out of this black garbage bag because they're not only escaping the adults, the newly hatched young are going to escape as well. And they go right out and they look for something to parasitize. So this is something I discovered on accident by not taking out the garbage can a couple times, noticing a stream of beneficials flying out of this, and it's something I've employed now. And again, I don't pay for wasps. They come in, we keep them around, and this allows me to keep a higher population naturally in that greenhouse. The last thing you want to do is have 100 parasitized aphids tripping the leaf off and throw it away, only to have them all go and die and not hatch out and attack that population. Identify pests early. Treat immediately and continuously. So don't treat once, don't treat twice, continuously until the problem is gone. Track pest numbers with that jeweler's loop, the 30x loop, or a magnifying glass, or other sampling methods like the sticky paper that we mentioned. Reestablish beneficial populations throughout the growing season to keep your crops healthy. So know that these waves are going to be happening, like we talked, the bad bug wave and the good bug wave, okay? They're going to be happening, but every so often it's nice to spike that population and jumble it up a little bit with some more beneficials, okay? That will always keep fresh lines in there. You're not going to have a big crash of your beneficial population, and it keeps those crops consistent, healthy, and bug-free. Lastly here, learn to predict what is coming and have your protection in place beforehand. If you know that your broad mites are going to come in the beginning of March every year, place out your other predatory mites 2 weeks into February so that they're well established by the time the broad mites come in, and they immediately feed on the broad mites as a food source. Okay, that's something we want to do. Forecast the problem before it's a problem, and especially before it's an out of control situation. Okay guys, and that's it for this presentation. I hope you learned a lot. I hope you love bugs now and you go out there and you're ready to employ some of these measures in your own operation. And I will see you next time during our next session. Thank you.